So my favorite definition of a philosophical problem is Wittgenstein's, when he says the form of a philosophical problem is, I don't know my way about, I don't find the way. And this may seem like an inane characterization of philosophy, but I think the deep point is that when you're dealing with a philosophical problem, the nature of the problem is itself at stake, and this means that the method that you're going to use to solve it, and the question what a solution, what form a solution should take, is itself at stake. It's not clear to you. And this is a contrast between philosophy, a difference between philosophy and mature special sciences, where you have much more of established methods, a consensus on what a solution should look like, even if you don't know the exact solution beforehand, and so on. So to me, this is very characteristic of philosophy. And this also means that in philosophy, the question of what philosophy is also itself at stake. I think it's misleading. It's no coincidence that I'm sitting here talking about what philosophy is. If you had invited a chemist to the chemistry department, it's not very likely that you would have him ask him about what chemistry is and ask him to reflect on that. So I think the question, what is philosophy, is often characterized as a meta-philosophical question, but I think the term meta-philosophy is itself misleading, because it suggests that the question about the nature of philosophy, the question what is philosophy, is a kind of special sub-discipline within the subject, rather than an integral part of philosophy itself. It's no coincidence that all the great thinkers all the great philosophers have been asking themselves what philosophy is, and it becomes for them an integral part of their philosophical investigations. Now, it is of course true that philosophical investigations and philosophical research can result in the establishment of a special science. And this has, of course, happened historically. Physics established itself as a special science when methods were developed such that a consensus was reached about how to approach physical problems within physics, what a solution would look like. Similarly, psychology established itself as a special science, sociology, and so on and so forth. And they all come from philosophy. So it might, of course, happen that philosophy results in the establishment of such sciences, but when that happens, it's also characteristic that these sciences splint themselves off from philosophy, okay, and become, in a sense, independent from philosophy. On the other hand, it might, of course, also happen that these special sciences, within these special sciences, philosophical questions arise anew. The sciences may run into a state of crisis, as happened in physics, for example, at the beginning of the 20th century. And then they again begin asking themselves characteristically philosophical questions. What does it mean to say that two events happen at the same time, for example? That is a kind of philosophical question. So in a sense, one could also think of philosophy as a crisis phenomenon. Characteristically, philosophical question arises when there is a kind of crisis in an intellectual endeavor. You're no longer sure about the exact content of your questions. The previous consensus about methods and the form of solutions is no longer there. And you have to think philosophically about how to deal with this situation. Such crises may arise in the sciences, but they may, of course, arise elsewhere. They may arise in politics. They may arise in religion. They may arise in the arts. They may arise in your personal life. And I think it's no coincidence that when when we run into such crisis, questions we can recognize as philosophical arise, precisely because there is a crisis present. Now, this may seem to lead to the conclusion that philosophy is a very chaotic endeavor. It doesn't involve the kind of discipline that established sciences involve. And in a sense, that is correct. But on the other hand, I don't think we as philosophers should be afraid of acknowledging that philosophy has this character. I think a philosophical education is useful to a large extent precisely because it gives you a training in how to deal with these kinds of situations. Because there is such a thing as getting such a training. It doesn't mean to get trained into very determined methods and get trained into, you know, a perfectly clear idea about what a solution to a philosophical problem would look like. But it gives you a kind of practical ability to deal with crises of this sort. And this is, I think, why philosophy can be really useful. And I want to object against the conception of philosophy where people try to say philosophy is a kind of science. Perhaps it is the most general science, but perhaps it is a science that deals with a specific domain of questions. Because in the end, I think such attempts to explain why philosophy is useful will always end up giving this impression that philosophy is a kind of second-rate science, an inferior science. It won't live up to the standards of physics or history or anything like that. So I think if we want to understand the value of philosophy, we should self-confidently acknowledge that philosophy is an activity where we don't have a consensus on how to solve the problem, what the problems are, what methods to apply, and so forth. To me, that is the value of philosophy, that it can really give you a training to handle such situations of crisis, rather than basing the value of philosophy on some idea that philosophy has some established methods and there is some consensus on what progress in philosophy looks like.